танцуем вальс, где мы с тобой танцуем вальс, где мы с тобой танцуем вальс в мажоре.
My name is Michael Nagler. I'm with the Meta Center for Nonviolence in Petaluma, California, reaching out to everyone in the spirit of the Elbe, which I regard as a very important first step. Cooperating against a common enemy is easy enough to do in a sense, but what we need to do now is to cooperate, working together on common projects, for example, like the rescue of the environment and the creating of institutions, more robust institutions for a stable world order and a world of peace and justice. Studies show that working together on a common, positive, constructive project like that are very powerful ways of creating friendship where before there may have been competition and hostility. So thank you very much.
My name is Matthew Arrett. On behalf of the Rising Tide Foundation and the Canadian Patriot Review, I'm addressing this audience from Canada, and I give my greatest hope and heartfelt thanks that this event is occurring and the opportunity that this very important day gives us to reflect not only upon the past and the effort and courage that it took our grandparents and our great-grandparents, and in some cases our parents, to defeat the plague of fascism from this earth, which could easily have been the basis of a new world order based upon fascist regimes controlled by financiers many, many, many years ago. And that didn't happen because of those sacrifices. But also the brotherhood between Russia and America meeting at the Elbe, which represented something much more as a great hope for the world. And they say that justice is something we take for granted. And in that sense, it's somewhat like oxygen. We don't think about it and easily take it for granted. But sometimes being deprived of oxygen for a sustained period causes one to fully appreciate things that were easily ignorable. And so too, perhaps, I can only hope that the absence of justice should make our hearts yearn for it ever more deeply, especially as we have come so close to an unnecessary conflagration, a confrontation militarily that could spell disaster not only for America and many Russians, but humanity as a whole, which would suffer greatly if a nuclear war were unleashed at this stage. So, with the hope that the better angels of our nature will ultimately win out, I hope that this day is a proper opportunity for all of us to think about doing more in our daily lives, to be peacemakers and build bridges, citizens diplomacy in every means that we have to wake up our fellow man and become more educated ourselves, and to be more participating in the acts of peacemaking that is so desperately needed. So again, thank you on this Elbe Day, and I leave it to the rest of the audience and the rest of the speakers to continue this conversation. Take care.
On this anniversary of the historic meeting on the Elbe River, it's important to look back and think of how close we once were and how far apart our two countries are today, and how dangerous that situation has become. I think back not only to the meeting on the Elbe River, but I go back even before that, when New York Times correspondent Ralph Parker wrote in April of 1942, "It would need a Tolstoy to describe the heroic endurance of the men and women who have made these things possible," referring to the Russian people and their resistance to the Nazis. The New York Times principal book reviewer, Orville Prescott, wrote that same year, "The vast armaments, the fighting skill, and magnificent courage of the Red Army may prove to have been the decisive factors in the salvation of the human race from Nazi slavery. Our debt of gratitude to the millions of Russian soldiers who have fought and died in this war, and who will continue to do so, is beyond estimation or expression. Even General Douglas MacArthur credited the Red Army with, quote, one of the greatest military feats in history. So during the war, the American people recognized the heroic contribution of the Russian army. And it's sad because nowadays, that has been so badly forgotten. When we look at the fact that in recent polling, only 17% of the Europeans credit the Soviets with having played a major role in the defeat of fascism in World War II. In France, only 7% credit the Soviets for having played a major role. In the United States, most Americans believe that the US almost single-handedly defeated the Nazis in Europe. And the history is so different. And those soldiers who met at the Elbe River knew how different it was. And they greeted each other as friends and comrades, working together in that noble effort to defeat fascists in World War II. And when Victory Day came, the Russians cheered in Moscow for Roosevelt because of that comradely relationship. And the last telegram that Roosevelt sent to Churchill before he died, he said, "These issues come up between the US and the Russians every day, and they all get resolved. We should not make a big deal about them." Roosevelt envisioned the US and Soviets working together in friendship in the post-war period. And had he lived longer, he would have seen that. Or had his vice president from 1940 to 1944, Henry Wallace, become president when Roosevelt died on April 12, 1945, instead of Harry Truman. And Wallace was a visionary, and Wallace shared Roosevelt's hopes for the future. And Wallace said on the first anniversary of Roosevelt's death, as Truman and his allies were inaugurating the Cold War and intensifying it, he said, "The only kind of competition we want with the Soviets is to demonstrate that we can raise our standard of living faster during the next 20 years than Russia. We shall compete with Russia in serving the spiritual and physical needs of the common man. The only way to defeat communism in the world is to do a better and smoother job of maximum production and optimum distribution. Let's make it a race. Let's make it a clean race, a determined race, but above all, a peaceful race in the service of humanity." Russia, and he goes on, says, "The source of all our mistakes is fear. Russia fears Anglo-Saxon encirclement. We fear communist penetration. If these fears continue, the day will come when our sons and grandsons will pay for these fears with rivers of blood. Out of fear, great nations have been acting like cornered beasts, thinking only of survival." And he went on to deplore Roosevelt's Iron Curtain speech, Churchill's on his Iron Curtain speech, and his intensification of Cold War enmity and hostility. And it was Wallace who tried to explain to Truman how American actions in the first year and a half of that Cold War looked to the Soviet people, and how America's aggression appeared to the Soviets. And as I'm going to find the Wallace quote here somewhere, but he says, how would it look to the Russians, to the Americans, if Russia had a fleet of bombers all over the world, bases all over the world, had a monopoly on atomic bombs, was vastly increasing its military spending? How would that look to the Americans? The same problem today. How do American actions look to the Russians? American aggression and America's seeming desire to destroy the Soviet Union like we had in 1945 and 1946. But the next major development that I'd like to point to is the next American leader in a position to really do something about it, because Wallace was silenced and his wisdom was not heeded. But in 1963, after the US and the Russians survived the Cuban Missile Crisis, John F. Kennedy had an epiphany. He had a change of heart. He realized how close we had come to nuclear annihilation. And in his commencement address in 1963 at American University, where I teach, and what was the proudest moment in American University's history, on June 10, 1963, President Kennedy made a speech in which he did not allow the CIA, the State Department, or the Pentagon to see it or weigh in advance. And the words are brilliant. And he says, some say that it is useless to speak of world peace or world law or world disarmament, and that it will be useless until the leaders of the Soviet Union adopt a more enlightened attitude. I hope they do. I believe we can help them to do it. But I also believe we must re-examine our own attitude as individuals and as a nation, for our attitude is as essential as theirs. And every graduate of this school, every thoughtful citizen who despairs of war and wishes to bring peace, should begin by looking inward, by examining his own attitude toward the possibilities of peace, toward the Soviet Union, toward the course of the Cold War, and toward freedom and peace here at home. And he goes on and says, second, let us re-examine our attitude toward the Soviet Union. It is sad to realize the extent of the gulf between us, but it is also a warning to the Americans not to see only a distorted and desperate view of the other side, not to see conflict as inevitable, accommodation as impossible, and communication as nothing more than an exchange of threats. No government or social system is so evil that its people must be considered as lacking in virtue. It goes on and talks about the good traits of the Russian people and the fact that the Russians have lost, he said, at least 20 million people in the World War II. We know now that the real figure is 27 million people. And he said that that was the equivalent of the entire United States east of Chicago having been destroyed. And he says, and he talks about the danger of nuclear war. And he says, all we have built, all we have worked for would be destroyed in the first 24 hours. And even the Cold War, which brings burdens and dangers to so many nations, including this nation's closest allies, our two countries bear the heaviest burdens. We are both devoting massive sums of money to weapons that can be better devoted to combating ignorance, poverty, and disease. And he talks about, he says, let us not be blind to our differences, but let us also direct attention to our common interests and to the means by which those differences can be resolved. And if it cannot end now, our differences, at least we can help make the world safe for diversity. For in the final analysis, our most basic common link is that we all inhabit this small planet. We all breathe the same air. We all cherish our children's future, and we are all mortal. And he goes on and says, nuclear powers must avert those confrontations which bring an adversary to a choice of either a humiliating retreat or a nuclear war. To adopt that kind of a course in the nuclear age would be evidence only of the bankruptcy of our policy or of a collective death wish for the world. And that's what we've seen recently as the proxy war over Ukraine continues, and as the risk of nuclear war, especially in Ukraine, but also over Gaza, also over Taiwan and the South China Sea, grows by the day. And that's the insanity of the present moment. At a time when the world is on the verge of war, the most dangerous moment that we've faced since the Cuban Missile Crisis, there is no diplomacy. The Americans and the Russians are not speaking. Our nuclear arms control treaties have all been abrogated. Our strategic stability talks don't exist. and there is no diplomacy. To not have diplomacy in a world that is so close to war is madness. So we have to revert, we have to go back to the spirit of the Elbe. We have to go back to our World War II alliance. We have to go back to the wisdom of Henry Wallace. We have to go back to the wisdom of John Kennedy, the previous Cold Warrior, in that last year of his life, when he and Khrushchev were working together to bring peace, to get rid of nuclear weapons. We can also talk about the meeting in Reykjavik between Gorbachev and Reagan, where they came so close to eliminating all strategic nuclear weapons. So we've had our chances and we've let them slip away. We cannot afford to do that again, because by the day, the world is getting closer and closer to military confrontation, which will almost certainly lead to World War III, which will almost certainly lead to nuclear war, which will almost certainly lead to nuclear winter and the effective annihilation of life on our planet. So, in the spirit of the Elbe, in the spirit of a multipolarity, in the spirit of friendship, in the spirit of comradeship, of collegiality, we must strive again to talk to each other, to resolve the conflicts peaceably, and to find world peace in this darkness that pervades us today. Thank you.
My name is Ray McGovern. I had the good fortune of being in Moscow on April 25th, 2015, to celebrate the 70th anniversary of the meeting on the Elbe. We know, honest historians know, that Russia, the Soviet Union, bore the brunt of the Nazi attack. But American logistical support was absolutely necessary and also played a crucial role. And I was reminded of that after I was given a chance to speak at this commemoration of the meeting on the Elbe. A general named Abdanov came up. He was an infantry general. And he said, Studebaker, 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 and he gave me a great big bear hug. Okay. Now, for those who don't know the crucial role that the auto manufacturer Studebaker played in providing all manner of really, really tough Jeeps and trucks and pieces to pull artillery for the Soviet forces in Europe, well, just look it up, okay? It's very impressive. Now, those were times when we could do anything вместе, together, okay? Things have fallen apart. We are at a time where our relationship, that is the U.S. and Russia, are at a state of almost disrepair, almost complete disrepair. And the best I could do now is to figure out how we got out of this the last time we were close to a nuclear exchange, and that was 1962, 62 years ago, when Cuba came into the fore. And we also had an exchange. Were it not for John Kennedy and Nikita Khrushchev settling this peacefully, we would not be around today. And so I was looking at what John Kennedy said just several months later, not quite a year later, after that confrontation. He appealed for peace. He extended his hand to Nikita Khrushchev and the Russians and said, look, we Americans need to examine our own conscience, and we need not to accept the notion that war is inevitable. Man-made crises are made by men, they can be resolved by men. And I took some little notes on what else John Kennedy said. Again, this is just a year after we almost blew one another and the rest of the planet up. He said this, quote, among the many traits that the peoples of our two countries have in common, none is stronger than the fact that, almost unique among major world powers, We have never been at war with each other. And no nation, said John Kennedy, in the history of battle has ever suffered more than the Soviet Union suffered during the course of World War II. We know the figures, 26, 27 million people. So, practical advice from John Kennedy, then and now. And I'll close with this. Above all, says President Kennedy in this wonderful speech on peace at American University, June 10, 1963. Above all, nuclear powers must avoid giving an adversary a choice of either a humiliating defeat, a humiliating retreat, or nuclear war. To adopt that kind of course in the nuclear age would be evidence only of the bankruptcy of our policy and a collective death wish for the world. In summary, I fear that we're back to a situation that is worse than 1962. There is very little communication between our leaders. I worry that what almost happened over Cuba will replace what happened 79 years ago when our two countries met our armed forces finally at the Elbe, and we decided we could defeat the Nazis, and we could do so much more. So in the memory of Nikita Khrushchev and John Kennedy, let's pray that sensible leadership will avoid facing either side with a humiliating choice between retreat or choosing to use nuclear weapons. It has become a current fear of mine, and I've been around a long time. Thank you very much.
Hello, I'm Diane Sayre, greeting you from the state of New York in the United States. I would like to congratulate everyone assembled for commemorating this very important 79th anniversary of the April 25th meeting of the American soldiers and the soldiers of the Soviet Union at the Elbe, demonstrating that they had thereby severed the German Nazi lines and that the defeat of fascism in Europe would soon occur. We must resolve to remember that commitment and that relief and joy of recognizing that we were putting an end to that evil as we strive again to rid the world of fascism wherever it is. And I would hope that we in the United States and the West may honor our ancestors who gave their lives in that struggle and return to a commitment to upholding the dignity of man everywhere on the planet. And in that spirit, by the time we get to the 80th anniversary of the meeting at the Elbe, the United States and the Russian Federation will be engaged in a shared mission for the good of mankind.
This is Alistair Scott speaking to you from London in the United Kingdom on this most memorable of days as we remember April the 25th, 1945, a day on which the meeting of the soldiers of both the Russian and American armies met on the banks of the Elbe River, an event which was to herald the imminent destruction of Nazi Germany, thus freeing the world of what we can only describe as an abomination, a stain on mankind, for which millions upon millions of brave men and women laid down their lives so that this abhorrent ideology would be destroyed forever. This historic meeting of East and West showed us that good can and will overcome evil, and that only by working together against evil can we live in peace and harmony, which is the very least that we, all of us, God's children, deserve on this fragile planet of ours. Was it not, however, an irony, a twist of fate perhaps, that the Russians who shook hands and embraced their American comrades of the US First Army on that day were in fact troops from the Red Army's First Ukrainian Front? Let this historic meeting all those years ago be more than just symbolic. Let us understand that acting as one, good will defeat evil. Only when Ukraine stands once again with Russia and America once again becomes a force for good will we be able to say that finally the joy that was evident on the banks of the river Elbe all those years ago and what that meeting symbolized has not been lost on this generation, and the countless millions of lives sacrificed in the defeat of Nazism have not been lost in vain. Now is the time for men of action to act, not for self-aggrandizement, not for profit, but in the interests of mankind. We have lost our way, but that brief encounter in 1945 between East and West showed us that if the will is there, together we can achieve anything. Doing nothing, however, should never be an option.
My name is Alex Cox. I'm a film director and I live in southern Oregon near the town of Ashland in the United States. My nationality is British. And I'm recording this message to say thank you to the Russian people for their victory over Nazism in 1945. Don't pay any attention to the stupid things said and done by the governments of the West or by the media of the West. The people of the world, regardless of where they live, haven't forgotten the spirit of the Elbe. And we thank you today, the Russian people. Cheers.
My name is Jack Gilroy. I'm an old man now, almost 90 years old. Back in 1945, as a boy, I remember the joy of Russians meeting Americans at the Elbe River. We thought so much good of the Russians then, but over the coming years, I was taught by school teachers, by church, by government, by movies, by radio, that the Russians were not good people. They were evil individuals. They were individuals who were godless, aggressive people. And that's when I began to change my mind when I saw the first Russians on a train between Salzburg and Vienna in 1955. Later, though I was told to look at my counterpart Russian for the last change of guard of Austria before the Treaty of 1955, I ended up looking maybe 5 or 10 feet away into the eyes of a young man, and I saw humanity. I saw a young man who had sort of a sad look on his face, maybe lonely, wanting to go home. And he had all the humanity of any other person that I saw. It was a game changer. I've never been the same since. I like the Russian people, love the Russian people.
Дорогие друзья, сегодня мы отмечаем одну из наиболее знаменательных дат в истории Второй мировой войны. 79 лет тому назад советские и американские войска ударом с востока и запада рассекли немецкий фронт и 25 апреля встретились на реке Эльба в центре Германии. Москва отметила это событие праздничным салютом. Торжества проходили и в Нью-Йорке. Фотографии того времени, того исторического дня доносят атмосферу огромной радости, охватившей обе союзные армии. У Советского Союза и Соединенных Штатов Америки тогда были абсолютно разные представления об устройстве жизни. Но наши страны сумели перешагнуть через обиды и комплексы, когда над миром нависла угроза коричневой чумы. Чем дальше отодвигается в прошлое тяжелейшая трагедия тех лет, тем настырнее становятся попытки западных политиков навязать новую трактовку истории. Поэтому так важно всем нам отстоять правду. Мы не должны допустить повторения прежних ошибок. Наш долг – искоренить фашистскую заразу, давшую глубокие, мощные побеги на Украине и в ряде европейских государств. Надо бороться против любых попыток оправдать нацистских преступников и их пособников. Как никогда важно передавать правду о войне нашим детям, цементировать историческую память о героях, подаривших нам возможность жить. Необходимо оберегать мемориалы и места захоронения воинов, погибших в борьбе за мир. Однако американские власти стали забывать историю. Вот уже 3-й год подряд посольству запрещают провести церемонию возложения венков к памятной табличке «Дух Эльбы» на Арлингтонском национальном кладбище в Вашингтоне. Мы это делали совместно с друзьями стран СНГ. Хочется верить, что рано или поздно в Вашингтоне вспомнят заветы героического поколения и осознают важность духа Эльбы как основы для равноправных и взаимовыгодных отношений.
Hello, my name is Quentin Casella, and I am from Ithaca, New York. I helped create the film Why Russia Fears the West, which details the long history of Western aggression towards Russia, and how this fear helps fuel the merchants of death, or the defense contractors in the United States and worldwide. The message today is that when we're able to put aside this manufactured fear, that as a society we can climb towards a lasting peace. Thank you.
Ciao a tutti, mi chiamo Dario Zuddu, sono di Genova, in Italia, vivo negli Stati Uniti, a Washington DC in particolare da molto tempo e mi occupo di prevenzione di conflitti internazionali, politica estera americana da altrettanto tempo. E devo dire che il cosiddetto spirito dell'Elba, come lo si descriverebbe in italiano, ha sempre avuto una grande forza di ispirazione per me e mi ha orientato sicuramente all'interesse per la pace e la diplomazia internazionale. La foto che ritrae il celebre abbraccio tra il tenente americano William Robertson e la sua controparte russa Alexander Silvashko ha sempre avuto un forte potere catartico, quasi emozionale per quanto mi riguarda, perché ci ricorda appunto che non esistono ostacoli preconcetti alla fratellanza tra gli uomini e sono sempre espedienti, strategie create dagli stessi uomini, forze avverse che ci vogliono convincere del contrario. E allora, come oggi, vi sono indubbiamente delle forze avverse, estremamente articolate, che vogliono convincerci dell'impossibilità di una relazione pacifica e armoniosa con la Russia. Allora, come oggi, dobbiamo assolutamente ribellarci a questa idea e a far rivivere lo spirito dell'Elba che la foto del tenente Robertson e del tenente Silvashko ancora oggi rappresenta in modo così poetico quasi e anche convincente, che lo spirito dell'Elba possa rivivere. A presto.
Всем нам пожелать, что все-таки вернулись бы те времена, когда мы стали не смотреть друг на друга сквозь оптику прицелов, а опять, как тогда на Эльбе, были вместе. И когда наши народы объединены, у нас действительно абсолютный успех во всех областях, от космоса до сельского хозяйства и так далее.